a year, but gosh, there was a lot. It seemed like there was something going on all the time. I enjoyed working there. I learned a lot while I was working there. Back then, I was still learning. I was tooling and good enough to tool for the shops, but I still wasn't where I wanted to be, and I was always trying to learn. But there was nobody to teach you, so you had to do it on your own. Even the tooling. But this time, I had was familiar with Tandy's and had worked for Tandy's and been around patterns and kits and a few people that was willing to help you learn. And so I learned a lot back then. But I was still, even with Tandy's, they didn't teach you the type of tooling that you need to do on saddles. It was mainly kits, small projects, and there was no patterns anywhere for saddles. You had to make up your own patterns. Somewhere along the line, somebody had made a set of patterns for a saddle at White's. They were hanging on the wall. There's a lot of leather, and what they do, they cut out the shape of a fender and a front and all the different pieces that got tooled. They cut out a piece of leather that shape, and then they would use a swivel knife and cut in the design on that piece of leather. And they would let it dry and then put a lot of lacquer or shellac on it so it would make it hard. And you could turn it over on a piece of a fender, for instance. You would wet your fender, turn it over on it, and take a hammer, and it was called a beat off because you beat it off with a hammer. And then after you're beating all over it, then you take it off and it would leave lines. And that was where you did the swivel knife cuts, and then you went from there. But somebody had to design that, come up with that design. I got pretty proficient at making my own designs. It seemed easy for me to do that. I enjoyed making up new designs. When I worked for Tandy, I did some design work and enjoyed it. With the saddles, there was several different ways you could go at it. The way the design was laid out. Back then they didn't use anything very small. They used large flowers, large leaves. This covered a lot and didn't take long to do it. As the years went on, the people decided to put more work into it, and the flowers got smaller. They got more on a fender. Back then, if you got 5 flowers on a fender, you were putting a lot of flowers on a fender. 3 usually was the max. You put 3 flowers on a fender, fill in around it with great big leaves. On a seat jockey, you might put 3 flowers and then fill in around it. But back then they tooled the stirrups, the cover on the stirrups. They tooled a lot. They covered a lot more area on a saddle with tooling than they do today. So I guess it worked out. You still put a lot of work in. A lot of background was dyed back then. They would dye the background black or brown. Most all your trophy saddles back then, the background was dyed. That took a lot of time. I built some trophy saddles. Well, I tooled the saddles for Mr. Myers while I was at White's. I tooled them and had to dye them. the background on them. And I would take them home at night and dye the background at night. And Evelyn would help me do that. We've got a picture of her sitting on the floor, scooted up with her feet under a coffee table, dyeing the background on a seat, I think it was. And she doesn't like me to show that because her bare feet was sticking up, and that was the biggest thing in the picture because it was the closest to the camera. I don't have very many pictures of me working back then or my work. I do have a small miniature saddle that I built. I was probably in my teens, early teens when I built this. I do still have that, and I want to get a picture of that on this tape somewhere. But that's the only thing I've got that I did back then. It's not in very good shape. Billy had it for years, and he finally, I was down there not long, 2 or 3 years ago, and he sent it back with me, and he said, see if you can do something to it to kind of preserve it a little bit. And I've been working on it. But the leather's dried out quite a bit. A lot of it was glued. I depended on the glue to hold it together because it was just so small to do stitching. I got wool skin on it, and a lot of that stuff that I just felt at that time I didn't think it needed stitching, so I just glued it together. Well, a lot of that glue is coming loose on it now. It's not in very good shape. I think, thinking back now, I wished I had, recorded some stuff that I did back then. Later on, I did when I started building saddles seriously. Then I started taking some pictures of the saddles and for something to show, for one thing. And that was the main thing at that time. I wasn't really thinking about for later on, but it was to help me sell the saddles then. Another funny thing that happened while I was at White's, wasn't actually in White's, it was at a bus stop. Evelyn and I lived close to uptown Fort Worth, and I rode a bus out to the north side. And I was sitting at a bus stop waiting to catch a bus to go back home one evening. And like most places back then, they had a bench about 5-6 foot long and at the bus stop, and I sat down. There was an elderly man there. I would say he's probably in his 60s or maybe 70s. And we got to talking a little bit, and he asked me what I wanted to know what I did, what kind of work I did, and I told him I was learning to do leather work and wanting to learn to build saddles. And he looked at me and he looked over and he got real serious and he said, "Young man, don't you know horses are going out of style? We got cars now." And he was really serious about it, man. And now it's almost 50 years later, and in some places of the country there's more horses now than there was back then. But it was really funny at the time. He thought horses was just gonna go away and it wasn't gonna be no more because we had cars. When I was working for Tandy's, I got to know a Mr. Drake, and he was in his 60s. He had been a saddle maker nearly all of his life, and he was working with Tandy's, and he helped them develop a saddle kit for a miniature. Uh, the seat was only 3.5 inches long, I think. The whole saddle, when it was finished, was about like that. In fact, I have still got one that I made back then off of one of their kits. So, like I said a while ago, that's the only thing I've got that survived all of these years that I made back then. But Mr. Drake lived, after I got to know him a little bit, I found out he lived just down the street, on the same street with us, except about 1.5 miles away. And he had a little building in his backyard. He had retired, but he still had this little shop in his backyard where he did some work and piddled when he wanted to. And so I would go down there, and he would give me some pointers along. And he was really interested in trying to help. I really enjoyed being around him and talking to him, because he wanted to help. And there was very few of them back then that would even talk to you about it. When I left White's, I went out to Saginaw, out past Saginaw, that's north of Fort Worth, and I went to work on a ranch northeast of Saginaw, about 4 or 5 miles. Pretty good sized ranch out there. They raised Hereford cattle, purebred Hereford cattle. We kept a few calves up in the barn to show. Had a huge old barn. Man, I think that was about the biggest barn I'd ever been in. Great, big hayloft, everything above. They had a second story in it, and everything above was hay storage. Man, I never saw it full. It would take some doing to fill that thing up. But the main floor, ground floor, was stalls to put calves in, show calves. And it was really a nice place. The barn was nice. They kept all the equipment up. They kept the pastures in good shape. The fencing always was in good shape. I don't know, I was there about a year and a half maybe, and I didn't ever have to do very little repair work on the fences because they were in good shape. We did some plowing. We had maybe 50 acres in hay that we had to plant every year. But we never harvested it. We always grazed it off. We'd plant it and let the cattle graze it. Always had real good pasture, but I guess to increase the herd a little bit, they planted this to supplement the pasture. They had another ranch right on almost the opposite side of Fort Worth from where we were at. It was north of the Weatherford Highway, the main highway going from Fort Worth to Weatherford. It was north of there. I don't know, 10, 15 miles. And I didn't do very much leather work while I worked for that ranch. It just seemed like I didn't have the time. When I got home of the evening, I was tired, and and didn't want food with it, I guess. But I did get to know Price McLaughlin during that time. He had a little bitty shop in Saginaw, and of course, first time I saw it, well, I was interested in leather and went in and visited with him a little bit, and so it got to the point where nearly every time I went to Saginaw for anything, if I had time, I would go in and visit a little bit with him, and got to know Price a little bit, and he knew I was interested in saddle work, so he would talk to me. Never tried to hide anything from me like a lot of them would. He was always nice and willing to talk. So I enjoyed talking to him. Price was, I really liked Price. He was a good guy to know. I enjoyed being around him and talking to him. Years later, he moved down the street and opened into a pretty good sized building. And I think he had 3 saddle makers working for him. And he had started wholesaling then, wholesaling saddles. And he still fooled with his horses. He had horses and he still fooled with them. Enjoyed that. And then I kind of lost track for a little while. Then later on I needed to do some sewing. Oh, I did some tooling for him. I tooled some saddles for him.